Before we begin tonight's journey through time, tell me, would you rather live in the Victorian era as a royal surrounded by luxury and duty, or in 2025 as an ordinary person with all the comfort and freedom of modern life? The morning light filters through the tall windows of Kensington Palace on June 20th, 1837. A young woman, barely 18 years old, is awakened before dawn with news that will change not only her life, but the course of human history. Her uncle, King William IV, has died during the night. She is now Queen Victoria, ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, sovereign of the world's most powerful empire. She will reign for 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, presiding over an era so transformative that it will forever bear her name. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the Victorian era, that extraordinary period from 1837 to 1901 that witnessed humanity's greatest leap forward since the Renaissance. We will walk the gas-lit streets of London, hear the thunder of steam engines, smell the coal smoke that darkened the skies of industrial cities, feel the weight of propriety and the burden of poverty, witness the birth of the modern world. This is not just the story of a queen, though Victoria herself was remarkable. It is the story of an entire civilization in transformation, of millions of lives caught between medieval past and modern future, of an age that shaped everything we know today. The Victorian era was a time of profound contradictions. It was the age of empire and the age of reform, the time of greatest progress and deepest exploitation, an era of strict morality and widespread vice, of stunning wealth and crushing poverty existing side by side on the same streets. It was the age when humanity truly began to conquer nature through technology, when science challenged religion, when democracy slowly expanded, when the modern city emerged in all its promise and horror. It was the time when Britain ruled a quarter of the Earth's surface and population, when the sun truly never set on British territory, when London was the undisputed centre of the world. But it was also the age of child labour in mines and factories, of workhouses and slums, of death from diseases we now prevent with simple vaccinations, of rigid class barriers and gender restrictions, of colonial exploitation and racist ideologies that justified empire. The Victorian era was humanity at its best and worst, its most creative and most cruel, its most hopeful and most desperate. To understand our world, we must understand this era, for we are all Victorians still, living with the systems, ideas, and problems they created. As we settle in for this long journey, imagine yourself transported back through time. The modern world fades away. Computers and cars vanish, electric lights dim and are replaced by gas lamps and candles. The roar of jets overhead becomes the clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones. You are entering a world that is at once alien and familiar, a world that our great-great-grandparents knew, a world that made our world possible. Let us begin where it all began, with a young queen and a kingdom on the brink of transformation. The young queen and her world Victoria was not supposed to be queen. She was born on May 24th, 1819, at Kensington Palace in London, the daughter of Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III. In the labyrinthine succession of the British monarchy, she seemed far from the throne, but death has a way of reshaping dynasties. Her father died when she was only 8 months old, carried away by pneumonia. Her uncle, King George IV, had no surviving legitimate children. Her next uncle, King William IV, also produced no legitimate heirs who survived to adulthood, though he had 10 children with his mistress, the actress Dorothea Jordan. As uncles died and cousins failed to produce heirs, young Victoria found herself moving steadily toward a crown she had never expected to wear. Her childhood was lonely and controlled. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's advisor, Sir John Conroy, kept Victoria isolated from court and society, implementing what they called the Kensington system. This was ostensibly for her protection, but it was also about control. They wanted Victoria dependent on them, so that when she became queen, They would become the true powers behind the throne. Victoria was never alone, never allowed to walk downstairs without someone holding her hand, never permitted to meet people without supervision. She slept in her mother's room every night until the day she became queen. She kept a diary, one of the only outlets for her feelings, and in its pages, we can sense her frustration, her isolation, and her growing determination that things would be different when she was in charge. That moment came at dawn on June 20th, 1837. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace and requested an audience. Victoria came down in her dressing gown, her hair still loose. They knelt and informed her that she was now queen. Her first act was to request an hour alone, the first time in her life she had been truly alone. When she emerged, she was transformed. The shy, controlled girl had become a monarch. Her first official meeting was with her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, and she made clear that her mother and Conroy would have no role in her reign. She moved her bed out of her mother's room that very day. But what kind of kingdom had Victoria inherited? Britain in 1837 was a nation in the midst of profound transformation, caught between the agricultural past and the industrial future. It was the world's greatest power, yes, but it was also a deeply troubled society, struggling with the implications of the changes sweeping through it. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century, was accelerating dramatically. Factories were multiplying, cities were swelling, traditional ways of life were dissolving. The population was growing at an unprecedented rate. In 1801, England and Wales had a population of about 9 million. By 1837, it had reached 14 million and was still climbing rapidly. The political system was archaic and unrepresentative. Only about 1 in 5 adult men could vote, and women could not vote at all. Rotten boroughs, constituencies with tiny populations, sent members to Parliament, while great industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no representation. The Great Reform Act of 1832 had made some changes, but Britain was still far from democratic. The aristocracy and landed gentry dominated politics, even as the industrial middle class was growing in wealth and demanding more influence. The working class, the millions who labored in factories and mines, had no voice at all in the political system that governed their lives. The economy was booming, but the benefits were distributed with stunning inequality. A small elite was becoming fabulously wealthy from trade, industry, and colonial exploitation, while the masses lived in conditions of poverty that we would now find appalling. In the industrial cities of the North, the Midlands, and Scotland, workers crowded into hastily built slums, whole families sharing single rooms with no sanitation, no clean water, no light or air. Disease was rampant. Cholera epidemics swept through cities, killing thousands. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases were endemic. Life expectancy in industrial cities could be as low as the mid-20s for working-class people. Child labor was universal and horrific. Children as young as 5 worked in factories and mines, their small bodies suited to tasks like crawling through narrow mine shafts or cleaning under machinery that was still running. They worked 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, 6 days a week. Education was not compulsory and not free. Most working-class children received no formal education at all. If they learned to read and write, it was from Sunday schools run by churches or from the occasional charitable institution. Religion dominated Victorian life in ways hard for modern people to understand. Britain was a deeply Christian nation, with the Church of England as the established church and a growing number of Protestant dissenters, Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, all competing for souls. Catholics, who had only recently been granted civil rights, faced continued discrimination. Jews existed on the margins of society. To be openly atheist or even agnostic was social and often professional suicide. Church attendance was expected, Sunday was strictly observed, and religious language permeated public discourse. Yet underneath this religious surface, doubt was growing. Scientific discoveries were raising uncomfortable questions about Genesis, about miracles, about the literal truth of Scripture. This tension between faith and reason would define much of Victorian intellectual life. The British Empire in 1837 was already vast, but would grow even larger under Victoria. Britain controlled Canada, parts of the Caribbean, South Africa, India, Australia, and New Zealand, along with numerous smaller territories and naval bases. The empire was the source of Britain's wealth and power, providing raw materials for British factories, markets for British goods, and places for British emigrants to settle. But it was also the source of moral contradictions that some Victorians recognized even then. The empire was maintained by force, by the superior military technology that British industry provided. Colonial subjects were not citizens, but subjects, ruled by British governors and administrators who answered to London, not to the local populations. Slavery had been abolished in the British Empire in 1833, a moral triumph that Victorians were justifiably proud of. Britain used its naval power to suppress the Atlantic slave trade, intercepting slave ships and freeing their human cargo. Yet, this moral achievement coexisted with continued exploitation of colonial peoples, with the destruction of traditional societies, with racism that assumed British superiority and imperial destiny. The Victorians could see themselves as civilizing the world while simultaneously looting it, as spreading progress while destroying cultures, as liberating people while conquering them. This was the world Victoria inherited, a world balanced between past and future, tradition and change, faith and doubt, poverty and progress. She was young, inexperienced, and female in an age that believed women were naturally inferior to men in reason and leadership. Yet she would master this world, would become its defining symbol, would give her name to an entire era. How did she do it? Partly through longevity, certainly. She outlived critics and rivals, became an institution simply by enduring, but also through genuine political skill, through understanding when to assert royal prerogative and when to defer to ministers, through adapting the monarchy to changing times while maintaining its mystique and dignity. The early years of her reign were dominated by her relationship with Lord Melbourne, the Prime Minister when she acceded to the throne. Melbourne was a Whig aristocrat, urbane and cynical, twice her age. He became something like a father figure to the young Queen, teaching her statecraft, explaining politics, guiding her through the complexities of constitutional monarchy. They met almost daily, often for hours. Melbourne enjoyed the role, and Victoria relied on him perhaps too much. When Melbourne's government fell in 1839, and Sir Robert Peel prepared to form a conservative government, Victoria resisted changing the ladies of her bedchamber, who were all Whig wives and relatives. This was technically her prerogative, but it was politically unwise. The crisis was resolved only when Melbourne returned to office, but it taught Victoria that a constitutional monarch must be above party, must work with any government that Parliament supports. Yet even as she was learning to be queen, Victoria was also discovering herself as a woman. Despite her position, despite her power, she was subject to the same emotions, the same needs as any other person. She was lonely. She wanted love. She wanted a family. And in 1839, she met the man who would transform not just her life, but the nature of the Victorian monarchy itself. His name was Albert, and he was a prince from a small German duchy called Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was also her first cousin, and from the moment they met, Victoria knew she wanted him. Love, marriage, and the royal partnership Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha arrived in England in October 1839, and Victoria was immediately smitten. She described him in her diary as excessively handsome, with beautiful blue eyes, an exquisite nose, and a fine mouth. He was accomplished, playing the piano and organ beautifully, speaking multiple languages, interested in art and science. He was serious-minded, moral, and intelligent. He was everything she wanted. There was only one problem. As queen, she had to propose to him. This was an unusual situation in Victorian society, where men were expected to initiate courtship, but constitutional protocol required that the sovereign propose to her consort, not the other way around. So on October 15th, 1839, 5 days after Albert arrived, Victoria summoned him to a private audience and proposed marriage. He accepted, of course. The wedding was set for February 10th, 1840. The marriage was controversial in ways that reveal Victorian prejudices and politics. Albert was German, and there was considerable anti-German sentiment in Britain. He was also relatively poor by royal standards, and Parliament was reluctant to grant him a large income. His rank and titles were also contentious. Should he be king, prince consort, or simply prince? Victoria wanted him to be king, but Parliament refused. He would be prince consort, though that title wouldn't be officially granted until 1857. These slights hurt Albert deeply and contributed to his sense that he was never fully accepted by the British establishment, but none of this mattered to Victoria. She was deeply, passionately in love. The wedding took place at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace. Victoria wore a white wedding dress of silk satin trimmed with orange blossoms, starting a tradition that continues to this day. Before Victoria, brides wore dresses of various colours. Her choice of white became the standard for Western weddings. The wedding was relatively small by royal standards, attended by only about 300 people. Victoria's journal entry for that day glows with happiness. She described herself as the happiest being that ever existed. The honeymoon was brief, just 2 days at Windsor Castle, because Victoria insisted she had too much work to neglect her duties longer. This was telling. Even in the first days of her marriage, she asserted her role as monarch. She loved Albert, but she was still queen, and queenship took precedence. This created early tensions in the marriage. Albert, like most Victorian men, believed the husband should be master in his home. But this was no ordinary home, and Victoria was no ordinary wife. She was queen, and he was, technically, her subject. These tensions eased over time as they developed a genuine partnership. Albert was brilliant, and Victoria gradually came to rely on his judgment. She began sharing state papers with him, asking his advice, eventually having him sit in on her meetings with ministers. Albert effectively became her private secretary, drafting correspondence, preparing memoranda, organizing her schedule. He was tireless, working long hours on both royal duties and his own projects. His influence on the monarchy was profound and lasting. Albert brought a seriousness of purpose to the royal family that it had lacked. The previous generation of royals had been notorious for their dissolute lifestyles, their mistresses, their debts, their public scandals. George IV had been fat, lazy, and extravagant. William IV had been decent but mediocre. Albert insisted on dignity, morality, and usefulness. He believed the monarchy must earn public respect through good works and moral example. He involved himself in countless charitable and educational projects. He promoted the arts and sciences, served as patron of learned societies, pushed for educational reform, and improved working conditions. He was also devoted to his growing family. Victoria became pregnant almost immediately after the wedding, giving birth to their first child, Victoria, the Princess Royal, in November 1840. Over the next 17 years, she would have 8 more children: Edward, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Victoria disliked pregnancy and childbirth intensely, finding it degrading and painful. She complained bitterly about the unfairness that women had to suffer so much while men got off scot-free. Yet she kept having children, partly because contraception was unreliable, partly because marital sex was expected, and she was passionate by nature. Albert was a devoted father in an age when upper-class fathers were often distant figures. He played with the children, supervised their education, worried about their development. He was particularly close to his eldest daughter, Vicky, who inherited his intelligence and seriousness. The royal household that Albert and Victoria created at Windsor Castle, Balmoral in Scotland, and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight was described as exemplifying domestic virtue. They emphasized family life, simple pleasures, moral rectitude. This was carefully calculated. Albert understood that the monarchy needed to embody the values of the emerging middle class: hard work, sobriety, family devotion, moral uprightness. This rebranding of the monarchy was necessary because republicanism was a real threat in the early Victorian period. Revolutions swept Europe in 1848, toppling monarchies and establishing republics, if often temporarily. The British monarchy's future was not secure. By making the royal family middle class in its values, if not in its wealth and position, Albert helped ensure its survival. The Victorians could look at their queen and see not a distant, aristocratic figure, but a wife and mother who shared their values, who loved her husband and children, who worked hard and lived morally. This image was not entirely false. Victoria and Albert did have a genuine love match, rare among royal couples of the time. They shared interests, had long conversations, read together, appreciated art and music together. Victoria's letters and diaries from this period overflow with love and admiration for Albert. She called him her angel, her dear one, her beloved. When they argued, and they did argue, she was devastated and quickly sought reconciliation. She needed his approval, his love, his presence. But the image was also carefully managed. The royal family's troubles were hidden. When the Prince of Wales proved difficult and disappointing, when other children showed signs of rebellion or weakness, when Victoria's temper exploded in rage at her servants or her children, all this was kept private. The public saw only the ideal, the devoted couple, the happy family, the moral exemplars. Albert also had grander visions. He believed in progress, in humanity's capacity to improve through reason and industry. He believed Britain had a mission to lead the world in this progress, and in 1849, he conceived of a project that would embody all these beliefs, that would showcase Britain's achievements to the world, that would celebrate industry, science, and international cooperation. It would be called the Great Exhibition, and it would be held in a building so innovative, so stunning, that people would call it the Crystal Palace. The Great Exhibition and peak confidence. The Great Exhibition of the works of industry of all nations opened in Hyde Park, London on May 1st, 1851. It was the first international exhibition of manufactured products, a showcase for the Industrial Revolution, and a statement of Britain's global dominance. The building that housed it was itself a marvel, a massive structure of cast iron and glass designed by Joseph Paxton, covering over 900,000 square feet. It was called the Crystal Palace because sunlight streamed through its glass walls and roof, creating an interior of light and air unlike any building the world had seen. The exhibition was Albert's passion project. He chaired the royal commission that organized it, personally negotiated with manufacturers and governments, dealt with skeptics who thought it would be a disaster, raised funds, managed logistics. His vision was ambitious: to bring together the products of all nations, to promote free trade and international cooperation, to demonstrate the benefits of industry and progress, to educate the public about the wonders of the modern age. Critics mocked the idea, predicted failure, warned of foreign revolutionaries using the exhibition as cover for assassination or insurrection. But Albert persevered, and he was vindicated beyond anyone's expectations. The exhibition was an enormous success. Over 6 million people visited during its 5.5 months of operation, at a time when Britain's entire population was about 20 million. They came from all classes, from the wealthy who could afford multiple visits to working-class families who saved for months to make the journey to London. Special trains brought visitors from across Britain. The admission price varied by day, with cheaper days allowing working people to attend. Inside the Crystal Palace, visitors encountered wonders: Over 100,000 objects from around the world, organized by country and category. The British exhibits dominated naturally. There were locomotives and hydraulic presses, textile machinery and steam hammers, industrial equipment showcasing the technology that had made Britain the workshop of the world. But there were also exhibits from dozens of other nations. From India came shawls and jewels, the enormous Koh-i-Noor diamond that Victoria would later wear in her crown. From China came silk and porcelain. From America came McCormick's mechanical reaper and Samuel Colt's revolvers. From France came luxury goods, tapestries and furniture. The exhibition was a material encyclopedia of the world. Everything humanity could make arranged in a single building. For visitors, it was overwhelming and intoxicating. Imagine being a farm laborer who had never left your village, never seen a city, never encountered anything more technological than a plough. Suddenly you're in London, walking through this palace of glass and iron, seeing machines that could do the work of hundreds of men, seeing goods from countries you'd never heard of, seeing evidence of human creativity and industry on a scale you could never have imagined. The psychological impact was profound. The exhibition taught millions of Britons that they lived in an age of progress, that the modern world was being created around them, that Britain was at the center of this transformation. The exhibition also made a profit, about £180,000, which was used to fund educational and cultural institutions in South Kensington, including what would become the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Imperial College London. The Crystal Palace itself was disassembled and rebuilt in South London, where it stood until it was destroyed by fire in 1936. But its impact lasted far longer. The Great Exhibition established a model that would be copied worldwide. The International Exposition as a showcase for national achievement and industrial progress. More deeply, the Great Exhibition captured a moment of supreme confidence in Britain's destiny. In 1851, Britain was unquestionably the world's leading power. It had the largest empire, the strongest navy, the most advanced industry, the greatest wealth. London was the world's financial centre. British goods flooded global markets. British capital funded development worldwide. British cultural influence spread through the empire and beyond. The mid-Victorian period, roughly from 1850 to 1870, was Britain's zenith, when its dominance seemed permanent and natural, ordained by providence or by racial superiority, or simply by the logic of progress. This confidence was expressed in the architecture of the age. The Victorians built on a grand scale, railway stations like cathedrals, town halls like palaces, museums and libraries as temples to knowledge. Gothic Revival architecture expressed nostalgia for a medieval past, combined with modern industrial materials. Churches sprouted spires reaching toward heaven while factories poured smoke into it. The Victorians reshaped Britain's physical landscape more thoroughly than any people since the Romans, covering the countryside with railway lines, digging canals, building roads, draining wetlands, enclosing commons, transforming agriculture, creating suburbs. They also reshaped the empire. The mid-Victorian period saw aggressive expansion of British territory and British influence worldwide. In India, which had been ruled through the East India Company, the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857 led to the company's dissolution and direct British rule. Victoria became Empress of India in 1876, a title she cherished. In Africa, explorers like David Livingstone opened the interior to British influence. Missionaries followed, and traders and administrators came behind them. In China, Britain fought the Opium Wars to force China to accept British imports of opium from India, a policy so morally indefensible that it's remarkable even by imperial standards. This imperial expansion was justified by a complex ideology that combined economic self-interest, racial theory, religious mission, and genuine belief in progress. Victorians convinced themselves that empire was beneficial for colonized peoples, that British rule brought civilization, Christianity, justice, and progress to benighted lands. They pointed to the abolition of practices like sati in India, to the building of railways and telegraph lines, to the establishment of schools and hospitals. They conveniently ignored or minimized the destruction of local economies, the famines that killed millions, the violence used to maintain control, the racism that excluded colonial subjects from equality even in theory. The confidence of mid-Victorian Britain rested on economic growth that seemed limitless. British industrial production expanded year after year. New industries emerged: chemical manufacturing, steel production using the Bessemer process, telegraph and later telephone systems, electrical engineering. British companies pioneered these technologies and exported them worldwide. British engineers built railways across India, South America, and Africa. British capital funded development from Argentina to Australia. The City of London financed the world. This economic success benefited many but not all Britons. The middle class, that growing group of professionals, businessmen, and skilled workers, prospered enormously. They built comfortable suburban homes, sent their sons to new public schools, enjoyed consumer goods that previous generations could never have afforded. The working class also saw some improvement, particularly skilled workers who organized into trade unions and demanded better wages and conditions. Real wages rose during the mid-Victorian period, and some consumer goods became cheaper through mass production. But poverty persisted, often hidden from middle-class view, in the courts and alleys of East London, in the industrial slums of Manchester and Glasgow, in rural areas depopulated by agricultural mechanization. Millions lived lives of desperation and deprivation. For them, the great exhibition's wonders were irrelevant, the empire's glory meaningless. They struggled to feed their families, to keep warm in winter, to survive diseases that proper sanitation and medical care could have prevented. The contrast between rich and poor in Victorian Britain was stark and growing starker, and while some reformers worked to address it, many more simply accepted it as natural and inevitable. Yet even in addressing poverty and injustice, the Victorians displayed their characteristic confidence. They believed problems could be solved through reason and will, through legislation and organization, through science and engineering. If cities were filthy, build sewers. If children were dying from preventable diseases, improve sanitation. If workers were exploited, regulate working conditions. If ignorance kept people poor, establish schools. The Victorian faith in progress was not just about technology, but about society itself, about humanity's capacity to make things better through deliberate effort. This optimism would be tested by events, by economic depressions, by imperial setbacks, by the growing awareness that progress came with costs. And it would be tested personally for Victoria by a tragedy that would transform her and, through her, the monarchy itself. In December 1861, Albert fell ill with what was probably typhoid fever. Within 2 weeks he was dead. Victoria was devastated, and the long decades of her widowhood would define the later Victorian period as much as Albert's partnership had defined the earlier years. Empire. The sun never sets. At its height in the late Victorian period, the British Empire covered more than 13 million square miles, about a quarter of the Earth's land surface. It included nearly 400 million people, about a quarter of humanity. British territory stretched across every inhabited continent, from Canada to Australia, from India to South Africa, from the Caribbean to Singapore. British naval bases dotted the world's oceans. British merchant ships carried the majority of world trade. British capital financed development on every continent. It was, in truth, the largest empire in human history, and its extent and power have never been matched. This empire was not created according to a master plan. It accumulated over centuries through a combination of strategic calculation, commercial ambition, opportunistic conquest, and sometimes sheer accident. Some territories, like India and Canada, were acquired through the activities of chartered trading companies that gradually assumed governmental functions. Others, like Australia and New Zealand, were settled by British emigrants who displaced or destroyed indigenous populations. Still others, like Egypt and large parts of Africa, were acquired in the late Victorian period through a combination of financial control and military intervention. The motives for empire were complex and often contradictory. Economic interests were certainly central. The empire provided raw materials for British industry: cotton from India and Egypt, wool from Australia, rubber from Malaya, minerals from South Africa and Canada. It provided markets for British manufactured goods, though often these markets had to be created by destroying local industries. India's textile industry, for example, was systematically destroyed to make Indians dependent on British cloth. The empire also provided investment opportunities for British capital, places where British banks and investors could fund railways, mines, plantations, and infrastructure, earning returns far higher than in mature British markets. But empire was not just about profit. It was also about power, about Britain's strategic position in a world of competing empires. Control of India gave Britain dominance in the Indian Ocean and access to markets in Asia. Control of South Africa and Egypt secured the routes to India. Naval bases around the world allowed the Royal Navy to project British power globally and to protect British shipping. In this sense, empire was self-perpetuating. Each acquisition seemed to require new acquisitions to protect it. Each extension of influence created new vulnerabilities that demanded further extension. Empire was also justified through ideology. Victorians convinced themselves that they had a civilizing mission, a duty to bring progress, Christianity, and proper government to less fortunate peoples. This ideology is sometimes called the white man's burden, from Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem of that name. It combined genuine philanthropic impulse with profound racism, believing that non-white peoples were inherently inferior but could be improved through British rule and tutelage. Missionaries spread Christianity, believing they were saving souls. Administrators established legal systems, believing they were bringing justice. Engineers built infrastructure, believing they were enabling development. This ideology obscured the reality of imperial rule, which was maintained by force and served British interests first. When Indians rebelled in 1857, the British response was brutal. Mass executions, collective punishments, deliberate atrocities designed to terrorize the population into submission. When Africans resisted colonization, they faced overwhelming firepower. The Maxim gun, the first true machine gun, gave tiny European forces the ability to slaughter African warriors in vast numbers. At the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan in 1898, British and Egyptian forces killed nearly 12,000 Sudanese while losing only 47 men themselves. Such one-sided engagements were common in the imperial wars of the late Victorian period. The jewel in the imperial crown was India. The British had been in India since the 17th century, when the East India Company established trading posts. Over time, through a combination of military conquest and political manipulation, the company gained control over larger and larger territories. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, triggered by a rumor that rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers, led to the company's dissolution and the establishment of direct crown rule. Under the Raj, as British rule in India was known, India became central to the British economy. Indian revenues paid for the British Indian Army, which was used not just to control India, but to project British power throughout Asia. Indian soldiers fought for Britain in China, Burma, Afghanistan, and Africa. Indian taxpayers funded infrastructure that primarily served British interests. Railways were built to move British troops and Indian exports to ports, not to develop India itself. Famine killed millions of Indians during British rule, particularly devastating famines in the 1870s and 1890s, yet grain continued to be exported from India to Britain even as people starved. Yet British rule also brought changes that had lasting impacts, for good and ill. English became a common language among India's educated elite, eventually becoming the language of Indian independence movements. Railways and telegraph connected India's diverse regions. Western education introduced Indians to concepts like nationalism and democracy that would ultimately be turned against British rule. Legal systems based on British models replaced older systems, though they often failed to account for Indian traditions and customs. The relationship between Britain and India was profoundly unequal. Indians were subjects, not citizens. They could not vote for the British Parliament that made laws for them. High administrative positions were reserved for British officials. Indians faced discrimination in their own country, excluded from clubs and institutions, treated as inferior in their own land. Yet educated Indians increasingly organized to demand rights and representation, leading to the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885. The seeds of Indian independence were planted during the late Victorian period, though the harvest would not come until after World War II. Africa saw the most dramatic imperial expansion during Victoria's reign. At the start of her reign, European control in Africa was limited to coastal areas and a few colonies. The interior was largely unknown to Europeans, blank spaces on maps. But during the late Victorian period, the scramble for Africa saw the continent partitioned among European powers with astonishing speed. Between 1880 and 1900, European control expanded from about 10% of Africa to about 90%. Britain acquired vast territories in southern and eastern Africa. Cecil Rhodes, the British businessman and imperialist, dreamed of a Cape to Cairo railway running through continuous British territory. This dream was never fully realized, but Britain did acquire Rhodesia, Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, and many other territories. The acquisition was often violent. The Boer War of 1899 to 1902, fought against Dutch-descended settlers in South Africa, was particularly brutal, with Britain establishing concentration camps where Boer civilians died in large numbers from disease and malnutrition. The scramble for Africa was partly economic, driven by hopes of mineral wealth and new markets, but it was also competitive, driven by rivalry with other European powers, particularly France and Germany. And it was ideological, driven by social Darwinist ideas that stronger races naturally dominated weaker ones, that European civilization had a duty and right to rule the world. The empire transformed Britain itself as much as it transformed colonized territories. Imperial goods flooded British markets. Tea from India and Ceylon, sugar from the Caribbean, cocoa from West Africa, wool and mutton from Australia and New Zealand. These became staples of British life. The cup of tea with milk and sugar that became quintessentially British was itself an imperial product. Impossible without the triangular trade connecting Britain, Asia, and its colonies. Imperial imagery saturated British popular culture. Adventure novels set in far-flung territories, exhibitions displaying colonial peoples and products, advertising that used exotic imagery to sell domestic goods. The empire also provided an outlet for Britain's surplus population. Millions of Britons emigrated during the Victorian period, many to the white settler colonies of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. These colonies offered opportunities unavailable at home: cheap land, the possibility of social advancement, escape from Britain's rigid class structure. The emigrants were not just the poor and desperate, but also younger sons of middle-class families, skilled workers seeking better wages, people with some capital hoping to multiply it in less crowded markets. This emigration had profound demographic effects, populating vast territories with people of British descent and creating what became the Commonwealth of settler nations. Yet even at its peak, the empire contained the seeds of its own dissolution. The very education and values that Britain promoted in its colonies provided the ideological tools for resistance. Indian nationalists used British concepts of liberty and democracy to argue for independence. African students educated in British universities returned home to organize anti-colonial movements. The racism and exploitation inherent in imperial rule created resentments that would eventually overwhelm even the most sophisticated methods of control, and the costs of maintaining such a vast empire would become unsustainable, particularly after the world wars of the 20th century revealed Britain's relative decline compared to rising powers like the United States and the Soviet Union. But all of this lay in the future. In the late Victorian period, the empire seemed permanent, a natural expression of British superiority and destiny. Maps showing the world with British territories coloured red became symbols of national pride. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was literally true and seemed to many Britons an eternal truth, a reflection of some fundamental ordering of the world. They could not imagine a time when Britain would be a medium-sized European power, when the empire would dissolve into a collection of independent nations, when London would no longer be the capital of the world. Yet that time would come, and sooner than anyone in 1890 could have predicted. Victorian society, class, morality, and daily life. To understand the Victorian era, we must step away from queens and empires and enter the homes and streets where ordinary people lived their lives. Victorian society was intensely hierarchical, organized into classes that were supposedly fixed and natural, but were actually more fluid than the Victorians themselves often acknowledged. At the top stood the aristocracy and gentry, perhaps 2% of the population, who owned most of the land and wielded disproportionate political power despite their small numbers. Below them was the growing middle class, perhaps 15 to 20% of the population, ranging from wealthy industrialists and bankers to small shopkeepers and clerks. At the bottom was the working class, about 80% of the population, from skilled artisans to factory workers to agricultural labourers to the desperately poor who lived on the edge of starvation. Class was not just about money, but about culture, behaviour, accent, values. Each class had its own codes and expectations. The aristocracy valued lineage, land ownership, and leisure. They disdained trade and industry as ungentlemanly, though they were happy to profit from investments in such enterprises. Their lives revolved around country estates, the London social season, Parliament, and various sports like hunting and horse racing. They employed armies of servants who maintained their households and made their comfortable lives possible. The middle class was defined by respectability, that most important Victorian virtue. Respectability meant maintaining appearances, living within one's means, displaying moral uprightness, working hard, supporting one's family without relying on others. Middle-class homes were showcases of respectability, filled with furniture and decorative objects that demonstrated taste and prosperity. The parlour, where guests were received, was particularly important, often kept closed except when visitors called. Middle-class families employed at least one servant, usually a maid-of-all-work, and wealthier middle-class households might employ a cook, housemaid, and sometimes a governess for the children. The middle class was also defined by gender roles more rigid than in any previous era. The ideology of separate spheres held that men belonged in the public world of business and politics, while women belonged in the private domestic sphere. Men were rational, aggressive, suited for competition. Women were emotional, nurturing, suited for caring for home and children. This ideology was presented as natural and divinely ordained, though it was actually a product of industrial capitalism, which separated workplace from home and created the idea that home should be a refuge from the brutal commercial world. Middle-class women were expected to be pure, pious, domestic, and submissive. They were not supposed to work outside the home after marriage. Their role was to create a peaceful domestic haven for their husbands, to raise morally upright children, to oversee servants, to engage in appropriate charitable work. Reading novels was acceptable, reading newspapers less so. Playing the piano was encouraged. Engaging in political discussion was not. The ideal middle-class woman was an angel in the house, selflessly devoted to others. without ambitions or desires of her own. This ideal was, of course, impossible to achieve and created enormous psychological pressure. Many middle-class women suffered from mysterious ailments that we might now recognize as depression or anxiety. The medical profession, dominated by men, often diagnosed these as hysteria and prescribed rest cures that involved complete inactivity, making the problem worse. Other women rebelled in various ways, taking up causes like women's suffrage or social reform, writing novels that challenged conventional morality, or simply creating lives for themselves that defied social expectations. For working-class people, life was entirely different. Most worked 6 days a week, 10 to 12 hours a day or longer, in jobs that were physically exhausting and often dangerous. Factory workers operated machinery that could easily maim or kill. Miners descended into pits that could collapse or explode. Agricultural laborers worked in all weathers for minimal wages. Domestic servants, who made up the largest occupational category for women, worked from dawn to late evening, cleaning, cooking, and serving their employers with little time off and minimal privacy. Working-class housing in industrial cities was often horrific. Families crowded into single rooms in tenement buildings or back-to-back houses that lacked running water, indoor toilets, or adequate ventilation. Multiple families might share a single outdoor privy. Water came from street pumps that were often contaminated. Waste disposal was primitive or non-existent. Disease spread rapidly in such conditions, and mortality rates in working-class districts were vastly higher than in middle-class suburbs. Yet working-class communities developed their own cultures and solidarities. Pubs served as social centers where men gathered to drink, talk, and escape from crowded homes. Music halls provided entertainment that was rowdy and often sexually suggestive, very different from middle-class entertainments. Working-class families helped each other through hard times, creating informal welfare systems that supplemented the inadequate formal provisions. Trade unions organized workers to demand better wages and conditions, though unions remained illegal or heavily restricted for much of the Victorian period. Religion permeated Victorian life at all class levels, though its forms varied. The Church of England was the established church and retained considerable influence, particularly among the upper and middle classes. But Protestant nonconformity, including Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists, grew rapidly during the Victorian period, particularly among the working and lower middle classes. These denominations emphasized personal salvation, moral behavior, and often social reform. They built chapels in working-class districts, ran Sunday schools, and provided community services that the state did not offer. Catholic emancipation in 1829 allowed Catholics to hold public office, though anti-Catholic prejudice remained strong. Irish immigration, driven by famine in the 1840s, brought hundreds of thousands of Catholics to Britain, where they faced discrimination, but also established their own communities and institutions. Judaism remained a small but increasingly prominent minority, with successful Jewish families like the Rothschilds achieving wealth and influence, though casual anti-Semitism was widespread in Victorian society. Victorian morality, particularly sexual morality, was complex and often hypocritical. The public discourse emphasized chastity, particularly for women. Sex outside marriage was officially condemned, though the reality was far messier. Prostitution was widespread in Victorian cities, with tens of thousands of women earning their living this way, many driven by poverty. Middle-class and upper-class men routinely used prostitutes while publicly espousing strict moral standards. Venereal disease was endemic, though it could not be discussed in polite society. The sexual double standard was stark. A middle-class woman who had sex before marriage or engaged in adultery was ruined, unable to marry respectably, often disowned by her family. A man who did the same faced minimal consequences. This double standard was justified by the belief that women were naturally pure and asexual, while men had natural urges that needed outlets. When women expressed sexual desire, they were considered abnormal or depraved. Yet beneath the surface of Victorian propriety, there was considerable sexual experimentation and deviance. Pornography circulated widely, though it was illegal. Homosexuality, though illegal and socially unacceptable, existed in various subcultures, particularly in all-male environments like public schools and the military. The Victorian period was actually a time of considerable sexual anxiety, with the official morality constantly threatened by the reality of human behavior. Daily life for most Victorians was shaped by work, religion, and family in ways that are difficult for modern people to imagine. There was no weekend as we know it, only Sunday as a day of rest, and Sunday was supposed to be devoted to church and religious observance, not recreation. Entertainment options were limited by modern standards. There was no television, radio, or internet, obviously. Most people read little beyond the Bible and perhaps a newspaper. Music had to be made at home or heard in churches or music halls. Travel was expensive and difficult, though railways did make it possible for more people to take day trips or annual holidays to the seaside. Yet the Victorian period saw enormous changes in daily life, particularly for the middle class. Gas lighting replaced candles and oil lamps, transforming the nighttime experience of cities. Indoor plumbing and flush toilets gradually became standard in middle-class homes, though working-class housing lagged far behind. The telegraph, and later the telephone, revolutionized communication. Photography became increasingly accessible, allowing ordinary people to have images of themselves and their families for the first time. Canned food, refrigeration, and improved transport meant that diets became more varied and less seasonal. For all classes, childhood changed dramatically during the Victorian period. At the beginning of the era, children were seen as small adults, expected to work and contribute to the family economy from a young age. By the end, childhood was increasingly recognized as a distinct phase of life, requiring protection and education. Factory acts gradually restricted child labor. Education acts made schooling compulsory, though often only to age 12 or 13. The concept of adolescence was beginning to emerge, that transitional period between childhood and adulthood. The Victorian family was supposedly a haven of peace and affection, but the reality was often harsher. Domestic violence was common and legal. Husbands had the right to physically discipline their wives and children. Child mortality was high, and most families experienced the death of at least one child. Grief was a constant presence in Victorian life, and elaborate mourning rituals developed to manage it. Widows were expected to wear black for years. Memorial jewelry containing locks of the deceased's hair was common. Death was much more present in Victorian life than in our sanitized modern world. Yet for all its harshness and contradictions, Victorian society was held together by a genuine belief in progress and improvement. Even as they recognized social problems, the Victorians believed these could be solved through effort and reform. This faith in progress, this belief that tomorrow would be better than today, was perhaps the defining characteristic of Victorian culture. It inspired reformers to work for change, inventors to create new technologies, writers to imagine better worlds. It also blinded many to the costs of progress and to the voices of those who suffered under Victorian systems. The darker side. Poverty, reform and struggle behind the grand facades of Victorian prosperity lay depths of poverty and suffering that shocked even contemporaries. In the slums of East London, in the industrial districts of Manchester and Glasgow, in rural areas depopulated by enclosure and mechanisation, millions lived lives of desperate poverty that made a mockery of Victorian faith in progress. Charles Dickens, the most popular novelist of the age, made his reputation describing this other Victorian world. The workhouses, the debtors' prisons, the orphans, the criminals, the exploited workers. His novels were entertainment but also social documents, revealing to comfortable middle-class readers the reality of poverty in the world's richest nation. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had created a system designed to deter people from seeking relief. The principle was that conditions for paupers receiving poor relief should be worse than the conditions of the lowest paid independent labourer, a principle called less eligibility. This meant workhouses were deliberately made harsh and unpleasant to discourage the poor from seeking help. Families were separated upon entering the workhouse, with men, women, and children housed in different sections. The food was deliberately inadequate, the work pointless and degrading. The goal was to make poverty so unpleasant that people would do anything to avoid it. But the effect was often to trap people in destitution and to punish them for being poor. Dickens's Oliver Twist, published in 1838, exposed the cruelty of the workhouse system. The famous scene where Oliver asks for more gruel captured the heartlessness of a system that starved children to save money. The novel was a sensation, and while it did not immediately change the poor law, it did change public opinion, making it harder for authorities to ignore the suffering the system caused. This was one of literature's contributions to Victorian reform. Novels humanized the poor, made them individuals rather than statistics, created sympathy where there had been indifference. Child labour was another scandal that reformers gradually addressed. At the beginning of Victoria's reign, children as young as 5 or 6 worked in factories, mines, and fields. In textile mills, children crawled under spinning machinery to tie broken threads or clear debris, often while the machines were still operating. In coal mines, children pulled carts through narrow tunnels too small for adults, working in complete darkness for 12 or more hours. In agriculture, children performed back-breaking labour for minimal pay. Orphans and children from workhouses were particularly vulnerable, essentially sold to factories as cheap labour with no one to protect their interests. The Factory Acts gradually restricted child labour in textile mills. The 1833 Factory Act prohibited employment of children under 9 in textile factories and limited children aged 9 to 13 to 8 hours of work per day. The 1842 Mines Act prohibited employment of women and children under 10 in underground mines. The 1847 Factory Act limited working hours for women and children in textile factories to 10 hours per day. Each reform was bitterly opposed by factory owners who claimed it would ruin British industry. Each reform passed only after extensive investigation and documentation of abuses. These reforms were driven by a coalition of humanitarian reformers, many motivated by religious conviction, and conservative paternalists who believed that protecting the vulnerable was the duty of the wealthy and powerful. Lord Shaftesbury was particularly important, dedicating his life to improving conditions for workers, particularly children. He chaired commissions that investigated working conditions, spoke in Parliament, rallied public opinion. His efforts, and those of others like him, gradually created a body of factory legislation that, while inadequate by modern standards, did provide some protection for the most vulnerable workers. Public health was another area of desperate need. The rapid growth of industrial cities without adequate infrastructure created conditions of appalling filth. Human waste accumulated in the streets and courtyards of working-class districts. Drinking water came from rivers and wells often contaminated by sewage. Cholera epidemics swept through cities in 1832, 1848-49, 1854, and 1866, killing tens of thousands. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases were endemic, particularly in crowded slums where multiple families shared single rooms with no ventilation. Edwin Chadwick, a reformer and civil servant, investigated sanitary conditions and published his report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population in 1842. His findings were shocking. Life expectancy in Manchester was only 25 years for working-class people, compared to 44 years in rural areas. In Liverpool, more than 60% of working-class children died before age 5. These statistics galvanized reform. The Public Health Act of 1848 established a central board of health and allowed local authorities to establish local boards with powers to improve water supply, drainage, and sanitation. Implementation was slow and patchy, but gradually, British cities did improve their infrastructure. London's Great Sewer System, designed by Joseph Bazalgette and constructed in the 1860s, transformed the city's sanitation and dramatically reduced cholera deaths. Other cities followed suit. Clean water supplies, proper sewage disposal, and regulation of housing standards gradually reduced mortality rates. Public health reform was one of the great achievements of Victorian government, saving far more lives than any medical advance of the period. Education reform was another major struggle. At the beginning of Victoria's reign, there was no system of public education. Working-class children who received any education at all got it from charity schools, Sunday schools run by churches, or ragged schools that taught the poorest children. Middle-class children attended private day schools or boarding schools of varying quality. The wealthy employed tutors or sent their sons to elite public schools like Eton and Harrow. The result was that millions of children received no formal education and grew up illiterate. Reformers argued that education was both a moral duty and an economic necessity. Morally, all children deserved the opportunity to develop their capabilities. Economically, Britain needed an educated workforce to compete in an increasingly complex industrial economy. Religious groups were already providing some education, but they competed with each other, and their schools were underfunded and inadequate. The solution was controversial: government-funded education. The Education Act of 1870, known as Forster's Act, established a system of board schools funded by local taxes to supplement existing church schools. Education was not yet compulsory or free, but it was increasingly available. Subsequent acts made attendance compulsory to age 10, then age 12, then age 13. By the end of Victoria's reign, illiteracy had been dramatically reduced. Though education for working-class children remained basic, reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction, designed to produce disciplined workers rather than critical thinkers. Women's rights emerged as a major reform issue during the Victorian period. At the beginning of the era, women had almost no legal rights. Upon marriage, a woman's property became her husband's. She could not sign contracts, sue in court, or retain custody of her children if separated from her husband. Divorce was almost impossible for women and financially ruinous. Women could not vote or hold political office. Higher education was closed to them. Most professions barred them. The ideology of separate spheres confined them to the domestic realm. But women began to organize and demand change. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 allowed women to keep their own earnings and property after marriage, a revolutionary change. Women gained access to higher education with the founding of women's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford, though women could not actually receive degrees from these universities until well into the 20th century. Women entered professions like teaching and nursing in large numbers. Some became doctors despite enormous obstacles. Others became writers, with novelists like George Eliot and the Bronte sisters achieving both critical and popular success. The women's suffrage movement began in the Victorian period, though it would not achieve success until after World War I. Suffragists argued that women were entitled to political representation, that taxation without representation was unjust, that women's perspectives were needed in government. They organized petitions, held meetings, published newspapers. The Victorian period saw the emergence of feminist consciousness, the recognition that women's subordination was not natural but socially constructed and therefore changeable. Trade unions grew stronger during the Victorian period despite legal obstacles and employer opposition. Skilled workers organized to protect their crafts and demand better wages. The successful London dock strike of 1889 showed that even unskilled workers could organize effectively. Trade unions were not just economic organizations, but also social ones, providing sickness benefits, unemployment insurance, and funeral expenses for their members. They created working-class institutions that gave workers some power in an economic system stacked against them. Socialist ideas also circulated during the late Victorian period. The Social Democratic Federation, founded in 1881, was Britain's first socialist party. The Fabian Society, founded in 1884, advocated gradual socialist reform through democratic means. These organizations were small and had limited immediate impact, but they introduced socialist ideas into British political discourse and influenced the Labour Party that would emerge in the early 20th century. The Victorian period was thus a time of constant social struggle, of reformers working to address injustices, of the oppressed organizing to demand rights, of slow and partial progress punctuated by setbacks. The Victorian faith in progress was not entirely misplaced. Conditions did improve for many people during the era, but progress was neither inevitable nor universal, and it came only through the efforts of people who refused to accept injustice as natural or permanent. Science, progress, and Darwin's revolution. The Victorian era was the age of science, when systematic investigation of nature produced discoveries that transformed understanding of the world and humanity's place in it. The Victorians were obsessed with discovery, exploration, classification, measurement. They sent expeditions to map the world, dig up the past, collect specimens from every corner of the empire. Natural history museums were founded to house these collections and to educate the public about the wonders of nature. Science became a cultural force, not just the preserve of isolated gentlemen amateurs, but a recognized profession with its own institutions, publications, and public prestige. Yet Victorian science was also deeply unsettling, particularly when it touched on questions of human origins, morality, and purpose. The greatest scientific controversy of the age centered on Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, published in On the Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin's theory challenged the biblical account of creation, suggesting that species were not separately created by God, but evolved gradually through natural processes over vast periods of time. More threateningly, it implied that humans were not special creations made in God's image, but were simply another animal species, descended from ape-like ancestors. Darwin had actually developed his theory in the 1830s and 1840s, based partly on observations made during his voyage on HMS Beagle, but he delayed publication for 2 decades, partly because he was a thorough and cautious scientist who wanted more evidence, partly because he understood how controversial his ideas would be. When Alfred Russel Wallace independently developed a similar theory and sent it to Darwin in 1858, Darwin was pushed to finally publish. On the Origin of Species appeared in November 1859 and sold out its first printing immediately. The book's impact was explosive. Religious leaders attacked it as atheistic and immoral. If humans were just animals, they argued, what basis was there for morality? If the Bible's account of creation was wrong, how could any of Scripture be trusted? The Church of England and various nonconformist denominations saw evolution as a dire threat to faith. The famous debate between Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog who defended evolution aggressively, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce in 1860 became legendary, though accounts of what actually was said differ wildly. Yet many Victorians, including many clergy, found ways to reconcile evolution with religious faith. Perhaps God had created the universe with laws that produced evolution, they suggested. Perhaps the biblical creation account was metaphorical rather than literal. Perhaps evolution was God's method of creation, operating over vast time scales that the biblical authors could not have understood. These accommodations allowed many to accept evolution without abandoning Christianity. Darwin himself was more cautious in The Origin of Species, barely mentioning human evolution. But in 1871, he published The Descent of Man, which explicitly argued that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors. This was even more controversial, challenging human exceptionalism more directly. Yet by this time, evolution was becoming increasingly accepted in scientific circles, and the public was somewhat more prepared for the idea. The theory of evolution had implications beyond biology. Social Darwinism, though misnamed since Darwin himself did not advocate it, applied evolutionary concepts to human society. Social Darwinists argued that competition, struggle, and survival of the fittest were natural and beneficial, that helping the poor interfered with natural selection and weakened the species. This provided pseudo-scientific justification for laissez-faire economics and imperial conquest. If the British Empire dominated the world, social Darwinists argued, it was because the British were more evolved, more fit, naturally superior. These ideas are now recognized as deeply flawed and dangerous, but they had significant influence in the late Victorian period. They reinforced racism, justified economic inequality, and provided intellectual cover for exploitation. They also provoked opposition from reformers who argued that human society was different from nature, that cooperation was as important as competition, that helping the vulnerable was a moral duty regardless of evolutionary theory. Other scientific advances were less controversial, but equally important. Victorian engineers mastered materials and forces that transformed daily life. The telegraph, perfected in the 1840s, allowed near instantaneous communication across vast distances. The first transatlantic telegraph cable was laid in 1866, connecting Europe and America. By the end of Victoria's reign, telegraph cables crisscrossed the world, creating a global communication network that foreshadowed the internet. Photography, invented in the 1830s, became increasingly accessible during the Victorian period. Early photography required long exposure times and cumbersome equipment, but improvements made it practical for portraits and eventually for amateur use. Photography changed how Victorians saw themselves and their world, providing a way to preserve images with unprecedented accuracy. It was used for scientific documentation, journalism, art, and personal memory. The development of anesthesia revolutionized surgery. Before the 1840s, surgery was agonizing and dangerous, performed without pain relief except for alcohol or opium. Patients had to be held down forcibly. Surgeons competed to see who could amputate a limb fastest. The introduction of ether and then chloroform anesthesia made surgery bearable and allowed surgeons to take more time and care. Queen Victoria herself used chloroform during childbirth, helping to make it socially acceptable. Antiseptic surgery, introduced by Joseph Lister in the 1860s, dramatically reduced deaths from infection. Lister recognized that microorganisms caused infections and developed methods using carbolic acid to kill them. Combined with anesthesia, antiseptic technique transformed surgery from a last resort into a viable medical treatment. By the end of the Victorian period, complex surgeries were being performed that would have been impossible earlier. Medical understanding advanced in other ways too. The germ theory of disease gradually replaced earlier theories that blamed bad air or miasmas. John Snow's investigation of a cholera outbreak in London in 1854, tracing it to a contaminated water pump, was a landmark in epidemiology. Vaccination, pioneered by Edward Jenner for smallpox before the Victorian period, was extended to other diseases. Public health measures based on scientific understanding saved countless lives. Physics made enormous strides. James Clerk Maxwell developed equations describing electromagnetism, unifying electricity and magnetism, and predicting electromagnetic waves. William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, made fundamental contributions to thermodynamics and established the absolute temperature scale. Michael Faraday's work on electricity and magnetism laid the groundwork for electrical engineering. By the end of the Victorian period, electric lighting was beginning to replace gas, and electrical power was starting to drive industrial machinery. Chemistry also advanced rapidly. The periodic table was developed, organizing elements by their properties and predicting the existence of undiscovered elements. Organic chemistry emerged as a distinct field, leading to the synthesis of dyes, drugs, and other compounds. The chemical industry became increasingly important, producing materials that enabled other industries. Geology established Earth's great age, showing that the planet was millions of years old, not the few thousand years that biblical chronology suggested. This provided the timescale necessary for evolution to work. Paleontology discovered extinct species in the fossil record, including dinosaurs, showing that life on Earth had a history of continual change. Archaeology revealed ancient civilizations and deep human history, challenging ideas about human origins and progress. Victorian science was not just about discovery, but also about application. The Victorians believed that scientific knowledge should be useful, should improve life, should solve problems. This practical emphasis led to advances in engineering, agriculture, industry, and medicine that transformed society. It also led to science education becoming increasingly important, with new universities and technical schools training scientists and engineers. Yet Victorian science also had limitations and blind spots. It was dominated by men, with women largely excluded from scientific institutions and education. The few women who made scientific contributions, like Mary Anning in paleontology or Ada Lovelace in mathematics, had to overcome enormous obstacles. Victorian science was also shaped by the prejudices of its time, particularly racism and imperialism. Racial science attempted to classify human races hierarchically, providing pseudo-scientific justification for racism. These ideas were later discredited, but did real harm. Despite these flaws, Victorian science established the foundation for the modern scientific worldview. The commitment to empirical observation, systematic experimentation, mathematical description, and natural explanation, rather than supernatural or traditional explanations, became the standard approach to understanding the world. This scientific method, refined and developed over the Victorian period, is one of that era's most lasting legacies. Arts, literature, and culture. Victorian literature and art reflected the complexities and contradictions of the age. It was a period of astonishing creativity, producing novels, poetry, and art that remained central to English language culture. Yet it was also constrained by conventions of propriety and moral purpose that seem stifling to modern sensibilities. The Victorians believed that art should be edifying, that it should teach moral lessons and improve readers or viewers. Pure aesthetic appreciation was suspect. Art for art's sake was considered decadent. This didactic purpose shaped Victorian culture in profound ways. The Victorian novel reached heights perhaps never matched since. Charles Dickens was the giant of the age, producing works that combined social criticism with melodrama, realistic detail with symbolic meaning, humor with pathos. His novels appeared in monthly or weekly installments, keeping readers in suspense about their favorite characters' fates. He had an extraordinary ability to create memorable characters and to make readers care about people from classes they would never meet in real life. Novels like David Copperfield, Bleak House, and Great Expectations are still read and loved today. But Dickens was far from alone. George Eliot, the pen name of Mary Ann Evans, wrote novels of psychological depth and moral seriousness, exploring the constraints on women's lives and the ethical choices people face. Middlemarch, published in 1871-72, is considered by many to be the greatest English novel, a panoramic view of provincial life that examines multiple characters and their interconnected fates with extraordinary insight and compassion. The Bronte sisters, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, wrote novels that pushed boundaries and revealed the passion beneath Victorian propriety. Emily's Wuthering Heights is a fierce, strange book, quite unlike anything else in Victorian literature. A Gothic tale of obsessive love and revenge set on the Yorkshire moors. Charlotte's Jane Eyre is a feminist classic, with a heroine who insists on her own worth and refuses to be diminished by the men in her life. Thomas Hardy wrote novels and poems that challenged Victorian optimism, portraying lives destroyed by fate, chance, and rigid social conventions. His novels like Tess of the d'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure were controversial for their frank treatment of sexuality and their pessimistic worldview. The scandal surrounding Jude the Obscure led Hardy to abandon novels and focus on poetry for the rest of his life. Anthony Trollope produced a vast number of novels with detailed depictions of church, political and social life. His Barchester series depicted clergy and their families with gentle satire and realistic detail. His Palliser novels explored politics and the aristocracy. Trollope was perhaps the most Victorian of Victorian novelists, concerned with manners, morality, and the proper conduct of life within existing social structures. Sensation novels, a genre that emerged in the 1860s, pushed boundaries with plots involving bigamy, murder, adultery, and insanity. Wilkie Collins's The Woman in White and The Moonstone combined mystery and psychological suspense. Mary Elizabeth Braddon's Lady Audley's Secret featured a beautiful blonde heroine who was actually a bigamist and attempted murderer. These novels were popular but also criticized as immoral and sensationalistic. Children's literature flourished in the Victorian period. Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland created a surreal world that delighted children and adults alike. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island was a rollicking adventure that established many pirate story conventions. Francis Hodgson Burnett's novels, including The Secret Garden, explored children's emotional lives with sensitivity. Children's literature began to be seen as a distinct genre requiring its own artistic standards rather than being simply didactic material designed to teach moral lessons. Poetry in the Victorian period was dominated by Alfred, Lord Tennyson, who served as poet laureate for most of Victoria's reign. His poetry addressed contemporary doubts and anxieties while maintaining traditional forms. In Memoriam, his long elegy for his friend Arthur Hallam grappled with death, faith, and doubt in ways that resonated with Victorian readers struggling with similar questions. Robert Browning developed the dramatic monologue, poems spoken by fictional characters that revealed their psychology. His wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was also a major poet, though often overshadowed by her husband. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, founded in 1848 by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, William Holman Hunt, and John Everett Millais, rebelled against what they saw as the stale conventions of academic painting. They looked to medieval and early Renaissance art for inspiration, emphasizing brilliant color, precise detail, and symbolic meaning. Their paintings often depicted literary and mythological subjects with an intensity and sensuality that challenged Victorian conventions. Later, the aesthetic movement promoted art for art's sake, arguing that beauty needed no moral justification. Victorian architecture was eclectic, drawing on various historical styles. Gothic revival was particularly popular, seen in churches, universities, government buildings, and even railway stations. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a fire in 1834, exemplified Gothic revival. The style was associated with Christian values and English heritage, a nostalgic response to the disruptions of industrialization. But other styles also flourished: Italianate, classical, and eventually a uniquely Victorian style that combined elements from various sources. Music in Victorian Britain was enriched by both popular and classical traditions. Music halls provided working-class entertainment with popular songs and variety acts. Middle-class families gathered around the piano to sing popular ballads. Classical music was performed in new concert halls and at festivals. British composers like Arthur Sullivan, Edward Elgar, and later, at the end of the period, Ralph Vaughan Williams created music that reflected English musical traditions. Photography emerged as both an art form and a documentary medium. Early photographers like Julia Margaret Cameron created artistic portraits with soft focus and dramatic lighting. Others documented social conditions, wars, and distant lands, bringing images of the wider world to Victorian audiences. The photograph became a way to preserve family memories, with portrait studios appearing in every town and city. Theatre remained immensely popular across all classes. The West End developed as London's theatre district, offering everything from Shakespeare to melodrama to musical comedy. Provincial cities had their own theatres, Actor-managers like Henry Irving achieved celebrity status. The theatre was gradually becoming more respectable. At the beginning of the period, acting was barely considered a proper profession, but by the end, actors could be knighted for their services to culture. Victorian culture was also shaped by periodicals and newspapers. Magazines like Punch provided satirical commentary on current events. Literary journals published new fiction in installments. Women's magazines offered advice on fashion, housekeeping, and proper behavior. The expansion of literacy created a mass market for printed material, and publishers rushed to meet the demand with everything from improving literature to sensation novels to penny dreadfuls, cheap publications featuring lurid crime and adventure stories. The Victorian period saw the emergence of mass culture in recognizable modern forms. Advertising became increasingly sophisticated and ubiquitous. Consumer goods were marketed with brand names and distinctive packaging. Department stores appeared in major cities, offering vast selections of goods in elaborate buildings designed to encourage shopping as leisure activity. Harrods in London, founded in 1824 but expanding dramatically in the late Victorian period, exemplified this new commercial culture. Sports became organised and codified during the Victorian period. Football, rugby, cricket, tennis, all developed standardised rules and organised competitions. Sports were seen as character building, teaching teamwork, fair play, and physical courage. Public schools emphasised sports as part of education, believing they produced the leadership qualities needed to run an empire. The Olympic Games were revived in 1896, reflecting Victorian faith in international cooperation and physical culture. Leisure time increased for the middle class, and new forms of entertainment emerged to fill it. Seaside holidays became popular, with resorts like Brighton, Blackpool, and Scarborough developing to cater to visitors. Railways made these holidays accessible to the middle class and even to some working-class families on bank holidays. The seaside holiday, with its piers, promenades, and entertainments, became a distinctive feature of Victorian and later British culture. Museums and public libraries were established across Britain, reflecting the Victorian commitment to public education and improvement. The British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and many others opened their doors to the public, free of charge. These institutions were meant to educate and elevate the working and middle classes, to give them access to culture and knowledge previously reserved for the elite. This democratization of culture was one of the Victorian period's genuine achievements. Yet Victorian culture also had its repressions and silences. Sex could not be discussed openly in polite society. The naked human body was scandalous unless draped in classical garb or justified as art. Novels had to be circumspect about physical passion. Married couples in fiction might kiss chastely, but nothing more explicit could be described. This created a culture of euphemism and indirection, where everyone knew what was being discussed but no one could speak plainly about it. This repression created tensions that occasionally erupted. The trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895 for gross indecency exposed the hidden world of homosexual relationships in Victorian society. Wilde, a celebrated playwright and wit, was convicted and imprisoned, his reputation destroyed. The trial revealed the gap between Victorian public morality and private behaviour, and the viciousness with which society could turn on those who violated its sexual codes. Victorian culture was profoundly influential, shaping not just British but global culture. The English novel as we know it was largely a Victorian creation. Victorian poetry, art and architecture defined taste for generations. Victorian ideas about childhood, education, family life, and morality persisted well into the 20th century, and in some ways persist still. The Victorian period created much of what we think of as traditional British culture, even as it was itself a time of rapid change and innovation. Mourning, decline, and the end of an era. December 14th, 1861, was the day that changed Victoria's life and, in some ways, the character of her reign. Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle at the age of 42, probably from typhoid fever, though the exact cause of his death has been debated. Victoria was devastated beyond words. She had relied on Albert for everything: love, companionship, advice, support. He had been her partner in ruling, her helper in managing their 9 children, her best friend and closest confidant. She wrote that her life was at an end, that she was utterly crushed and broken-hearted. Victoria plunged into mourning with an intensity that shocked even the death-obsessed Victorians. She wore black for the rest of her life, another 40 years. She kept Albert's rooms exactly as they were when he died, with fresh clothes laid out daily and hot water brought for his shaving. She slept beside a photograph of him on his deathbed. She commissioned countless memorials, including the enormous Albert Memorial in Hyde Park, a Gothic monument of almost delirious elaboration. She retreated from public life, spending most of her time at Windsor, Balmoral, or Osborne, avoiding London and the ceremonies expected of a monarch. This extended mourning and seclusion created a crisis for the monarchy. Victoria was criticised for neglecting her duties, for indulging her grief at the expense of her role. Republicanism grew during the 1860s and early 1870s, with prominent figures questioning whether Britain needed a monarch who did nothing but mourn. The royal family's expenses were criticised in Parliament. Public opinion turned against the reclusive queen, who took her country's money but refused to perform public duties. What saved Victoria was partly time and partly political skill. She continued to work on state papers, to meet with ministers, to exert influence behind the scenes even when she avoided public appearances. She also benefited from scandals involving the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, whose dissolute lifestyle made Victoria seem dignified by comparison, and she was fortunate in her prime ministers during this period, particularly Benjamin Disraeli, who understood how to manage her and win her support. Disraeli and Victoria developed an extraordinary relationship. Disraeli flattered her outrageously, writing letters full of flowery compliments, treating her as a romantic heroine rather than an aging widow. Victoria loved it. She made Disraeli her favourite prime minister, supported his policies, gave him honours and gifts. When he made her Empress of India in 1876, she was delighted, feeling that the title recognised her importance and gave her status equal to the emperors of Germany, Austria, and Russia. The relationship between monarch and minister was so close that it raised constitutional questions about royal neutrality, but it also brought Victoria back to public life. By the 1880s, Victoria had become a symbol of continuity and tradition. As she aged and her reign lengthened, she became almost timeless, a permanent feature of British life. People who had been born after she became queen reached middle age with no memory of any other monarch. She became a grandmother figure for the nation, respected more than loved perhaps, but seen as embodying British values and stability. Her Golden Jubilee in 1887 and her Diamond Jubilee in 1897 were celebrated with genuine enthusiasm, marking 50 and 60 years on the throne. The Diamond Jubilee in particular was an imperial spectacle. Representatives from across the empire came to London for celebrations that lasted for weeks. There was a grand procession through London, with troops from every corner of the empire marching past the elderly queen, who sat in her carriage, too frail to leave it but still the centre of attention. The message was clear. Victoria was not just Queen of Britain, but Empress of a global empire, the symbolic mother of a quarter of humanity. The celebration was triumphant, but also tinged with anxiety. How much longer could she reign? What would follow her? Yet even as Victoria celebrated her long reign, the world was changing in ways that would ultimately undermine the Victorian order. New powers were rising. Germany, unified in 1871, was industrializing rapidly and building a powerful military. The United States was emerging as an economic giant. Japan was modernizing and would soon defeat Russia in war. The European powers were increasingly divided into alliance systems that would lead to World War I. The age of British dominance was ending, though few Victorians recognized it. Within Britain, too, change was accelerating. The labour movement was growing stronger, with trade unions organising more workers and socialist ideas gaining influence. Women's suffrage campaigns were becoming more militant. Irish nationalism was demanding home rule and would eventually demand independence. The working class was no longer willing to accept their subordinate position without protest. The rigid class structure of early Victorian society was breaking down, though slowly and with resistance. Technology continued to advance at an extraordinary pace. By the 1890s, Britain had electric lighting, telephones, motorcars, moving pictures, and even the first experiments with powered flight. The bicycle gave people new mobility. Mass circulation newspapers created new forms of public opinion. The modern consumer economy was emerging, with advertising, brand names, and mass production, transforming how people lived and what they aspired to own. The British Empire reached its greatest extent in the 1890s, but it was also facing new challenges. Colonial subjects were organizing resistance movements. The Boer War of 1899–1902 revealed the costs of empire, with Britain struggling to defeat a small group of Dutch farmers in South Africa, using brutal methods including concentration camps that killed thousands of civilians. The war was expensive, controversial, and damaging to Britain's international reputation. It suggested that empire could not be maintained indefinitely by force alone. Victoria's health declined in the late 1890s. She suffered from rheumatism, was increasingly blind from cataracts, and found it difficult to walk. But she continued working, reading state papers through a magnifying glass, meeting with ministers, maintaining correspondence. She was determined to die in harness as a working monarch rather than an invalid. In January 1901, she caught a cold that worsened. She died on January 22nd at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, including her grandson Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and her son, soon to be Edward VII. Victoria's death marked the end of an era in more than just name. She had reigned for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her. She had been the symbol of her age, giving her name to an entire epoch. The Victorian era had seen Britain transformed from a primarily agricultural nation to the world's leading industrial power, from a kingdom into the center of a global empire, from a society with limited democracy to one with universal male suffrage, from a world of sail and horse-drawn carriages to one of steam and electricity. The changes were so profound that Britons who lived through the entire Victorian period would have felt they inhabited two different worlds. The funeral was an imperial spectacle, with representatives from across the empire and heads of state from Europe attending. Victoria was buried at Frogmore beside Albert in a mausoleum she had built for them both. She had finally rejoined her beloved husband, 40 years after losing him. The Victorian era was over. The Edwardian era had begun, and with it came the final years before the catastrophe of World War I would destroy the world the Victorians had built. The Victorian legacy in our world. As the sun rises on the 21st century, we live in a world profoundly shaped by the Victorian era. The Victorians would find our world bewildering in many ways, with our technologies and social arrangements so different from theirs. Yet they would also recognize much that is familiar, for many of our systems, institutions, and ideas have Victorian origins. To understand the Victorian legacy, we must look at what they created that persists, what they began that we continue, and what they represented that we have rejected or transcended. The physical infrastructure of the modern world bears Victorian fingerprints everywhere. Railways, still the backbone of passenger transport in much of Europe and Asia, were pioneered by the Victorians. Many railway lines and stations built in the Victorian period are still in use today. The London Underground, the world's first subway system, opened in 1863 and continues to operate on routes laid down in the Victorian period. The sewers under London and other British cities, built by Victorian engineers, still carry waste today. Victorian bridges, viaducts, and tunnels remain in service. The Victorians built to last, and their engineering works testify to their skill and ambition. Our systems of government administration also have Victorian roots. The modern civil service, with competitive examinations and merit-based advancement, was created during the Victorian period to replace the older system of patronage and purchase. The Victorian belief in professional, non-partisan government administration remains a foundation of modern democratic states. Many government departments and agencies trace their origins to Victorian reforms. Our educational systems are largely Victorian creations. Universal compulsory education began in the Victorian period, and many of the structures remain. Age-based grades, standardized curricula, public examinations, teacher training colleges. The idea that education is a public good requiring government funding and regulation is a Victorian legacy. So are many elite schools and universities that expanded or were founded during the period. The Victorian era established many of our cultural institutions: museums, public libraries, art galleries, concert halls. Many were founded in the 19th century and continue to serve similar educational and cultural functions today. The Victorian belief that culture should be accessible to all, that museums and libraries should be free, that the state has a responsibility to preserve cultural heritage and make it available to citizens, remains influential. Victorian literature, art, and music remain central to our culture. Dickens's novels are still read and adapted for stage and screen. Victorian paintings hang in museums worldwide. Victorian buildings define the character of many British and American cities. Victorian Christmas traditions, popularized by Charles Dickens and Prince Albert, are still observed. The Victorian period created much of what we think of as traditional British culture, from afternoon tea to the carol service. In science and medicine, we build on Victorian foundations. Darwin's theory of evolution remains central to biology, though greatly elaborated and refined. Victorian engineering principles underlie modern practice, even as materials and methods have advanced. The commitment to empirical investigation, systematic research, and practical application that characterized Victorian science continues in modern scientific culture. The British Empire that the Victorians built and expanded has dissolved, but its legacy persists in complex ways. English is a global language partly because of Victorian imperialism. Many former colonies have inherited British legal systems, governmental structures, and administrative practices. The Commonwealth of Nations, though largely symbolic, connects former imperial territories. Cricket, rugby, and other sports spread through the empire remain popular worldwide. The impacts of colonialism, both positive and negative, continue to shape our world. Yet we have also rejected much of the Victorian legacy. Their rigid class structure has largely dissolved, though class remains significant in Britain and elsewhere. Their gender ideology, with its doctrine of separate spheres and women's subordination, has been challenged and largely overturned, though gender equality remains incomplete. Their sexual repression and hypocrisy have been replaced by more open attitudes, though debates about sexuality continue. Their racism and belief in cultural superiority have been discredited, though racism persists in different forms. Victorian attitudes toward poverty have changed dramatically. We no longer believe that poverty results from moral failing, that the poor should be punished for their condition, that charity creates dependency. Modern welfare states, while controversial and imperfect, represent a rejection of Victorian poor law principles. We recognize poverty as a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions, not individual moral failure requiring individual punishment. The Victorian faith in progress has been tempered by 20th century catastrophes. World War I destroyed Victorian optimism about civilization's inevitable advancement. The Somme and Passchendaele showed that technology could be used for unimaginable destruction. World War II and the Holocaust revealed depths of human evil that Victorian faith in moral progress could not have imagined. We are more skeptical about progress, more aware of its costs, more conscious that technological advancement does not automatically lead to moral improvement. Environmental consciousness has replaced Victorian confidence in humanity's mastery of nature. The Victorians saw nature as something to be conquered, controlled, exploited for human benefit. We now understand that environmental destruction threatens our survival, that humanity is part of nature rather than its master, that resources are finite. The Victorian Industrial Revolution created wealth, but also pollution, climate change, and ecological damage that we are still grappling with. Yet despite these changes, Victorian influences persist in ways both obvious and subtle. The Victorian work ethic, with its emphasis on diligence, punctuality, and responsibility, remains influential in modern workplace culture. Victorian ideas about childhood, family life, and education shape our assumptions even when we challenge them. Victorian moral categories, the distinction between deserving and undeserving poor, respectable and unrespectable behaviour, continue to influence social policy debates. The Victorian novel's influence on literature cannot be overstated. The realistic novel that dominates literary fiction has Victorian roots. The idea that literature should engage with social issues, that novels can be both entertaining and serious, that characters should be psychologically complex, all these assumptions come from the Victorian literary tradition. Modern genre fiction, from mysteries to science fiction to fantasy, emerged from Victorian popular literature. Perhaps most fundamentally, we inherited from the Victorians a particular way of thinking about time and change. The Victorians were acutely conscious of living in a time of transformation, of standing between past and future. They obsessively documented their world because they knew it was disappearing. They looked backward to an idealized past and forward to an uncertain future, feeling caught between the two. This temporal consciousness, this sense of living in a transitional moment, has become a permanent feature of modern life. We are all Victorians in this sense, always aware that our world is changing, always uncertain about what comes next. The Victorian era was not a golden age, and we should not romanticize it. It was a time of enormous suffering for millions, of exploitation and injustice, of hypocrisy and repression. But it was also a time of extraordinary achievement, of creativity and innovation, of people working to make the world better despite obstacles. The Victorians were complex, contradictory people. Neither heroes nor villains, but humans trying to navigate a rapidly changing world. Much as we are, understanding the Victorian era helps us understand ourselves, our world, and how we got here. The choices the Victorians made, the systems they created, the problems they solved and the ones they created or ignored, all shaped the world we inherited. We live with their successes and their failures, building on their achievements while trying to correct their mistakes. In this sense, we are all still living in the long shadow of the Victorian era, still working through questions they raised, still dealing with consequences of changes they set in motion. As the night grows deeper and this long journey through the Victorian era comes to its close, perhaps we can appreciate both the distance we've traveled from that world and the connections that remain. The Victorians would not recognize our smartphones or our social media, our airplanes or our computers, but they would recognize our debates about poverty and inequality, our struggles to balance freedom and security, our hopes for progress, and our fears of decline. They would understand the feeling of living in transformative times, of wondering whether change will bring salvation or disaster. The Victorian era was the bridge between the pre-modern and modern worlds, the crucible in which our contemporary civilization was forged. In those 63 years of Victoria's reign, humanity crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The modern world, with all its wonders and horrors, began in those decades of steam and empire, gaslight and reform, faith and doubt. And in understanding that extraordinary period, we understand something essential about who we are and how we became what we have become. If you found this journey through Victorian history enlightening, if the contemplation of that transformative era has sparked your curiosity, please consider subscribing to Nocturne of History for more explorations of the past that shaped our present. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what historical era you'd like to explore next. Perhaps you'd want to journey to ancient Rome, or medieval Europe, or the Renaissance. The past is vast and full of stories waiting to be told in the quiet hours of the night. Until we meet again in the stillness between waking and sleep, may your rest be peaceful and your dreams be vivid with all the worlds that have been. Good night, fellow travelers through time. The Victorian era has ended, but its echoes remain, whispering to us across the decades, reminding us that we too are making history, creating a legacy that future generations will examine with the same mixture of fascination, criticism and wonder that we bring to the Victorians tonight.